being here. I know it's the last session of the day, but I will tell the panelists not to be disheartened by this graveyard shift, because as it's about defence, we're sort of like the good child in the UK-EU divorce.
The last line.
We're not the troublemakers. We're the ones everyone wants to talk about because the other kids are a nightmare. We're the ones that everybody says, well, this is the way forward. Of course, last night's dinner showed that, even though they did serve fish over dinner, which I thought was very amusing. At the press conference last night, Antonio Costa said that there was a new positive energy around UK-EU defence. Ursula von der Leyen said she was ready to discuss deeper cooperation in security and defence with the UK. Most importantly, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk described defence and security as the easiest part of the conversation, which is where I want to start. The panel, it's a brilliant panel to round off the day. We have Sir Julian King, the former European Commissioner for the Security Union. We have Rosa Balfour, the head of Carnegie Europe. Alex Cresswell, who is the Vice President for Government Affairs and Public Policy at Graphcore. Sir Julian, is Tusk right?
I don't know about easy, but it's certainly pressing.
Easiest.
It's certainly pressing. So can I make one comment on the substance? And because we're in Brussels, one comment on the form.
Yeah.
On the substance, I think it's very encouraging that apparently both the EU and the UK, as they go into these discussions, recognise that you need quite a broad and integrated approach to defence and security.
Yeah.
So they're focused on these questions of capability building and funding and partnerships that were the subject of last night's dinner, and which are very important. But they're also talking about foreign and security policy and how you coordinate that, how you coordinate your objectives. They're talking about something that the UK side at least now appear to call safety, which in old speak is JJ and internal security, cracking down on the gangs, countering terrorism and that kind of thing. But they've also got a broader notion of what some people call economic security, so energy, cooperation, we've just been talking about, and thinking at least about how you work together to reduce your dependencies and increase your resilience. So I think they've got the right agenda. We can talk about some of the challenges of realising that agenda and rolling it forward. But I want to just say one thing on the form as well, reacting to one or two of the things that have been said earlier in the day. A number of speakers have said how it's important to sort of build for the future, go beyond the status quo. And I think that's particularly true on these subjects.
Yeah.
I think the TCA is there. We're not denying its importance. We just heard from Senator Grossi that you've got to do the things that you've said you're going to do. All that said, this is rooted in discussions that started 8 years ago, in effect. An agreement reached 5 years ago. It was, to a degree, of its time and context. And I think we're all agreed the world has changed since then. And the challenges, particularly on security and defence, have become much more pressing. So, take the TCA as a floor, if you like, floor FLOOR, but absolutely not as a ceiling. And if we're going to find ways of working together on these, to a degree, new challenges, or at least new forms of old challenges, then I think the fact that people are meeting in a summit, so engaging at the leaders level, that if you follow the way these things sometimes work, you then have sort of ambitious goals for the future, subject to regular review, the leaders getting reports and giving direction to their teams to work these things up. I think that kind of top-down driven political process is going to be very important if we're going to make progress on this.
Thank you. Rosa, I thought maybe we could take a little step back. I mean, when we talk about what this means, I mean, where are the obvious places where the two interlink? Where are the places where the low-hanging fruit, as it were, are?
Yeah, I mean, the low-hanging fruit is really unfolding in front of our eyes in Ukraine.
Right.
And here, and in fact, it's probably you, Henry, who wrote The Coalition of the Willing earlier this week, right? We're seeing this happen very quickly. The whole Western support of Ukraine was coordinated and led by Washington.
Yeah.
They were also leading on military procurement and coordination. That task has been passed over to NATO in preparation of the US elections, and the US is now gone. So we're seeing a coalition of the willing stepping up to support Ukraine, and that has a very strong defence and military dimension, and it's not confined to EU, UK. So I think where the challenge for the EU is to make sure that whatever defence, the EU and the UK, whatever defence pact they find is actually dovetailed with the efforts that are ongoing and rapidly moving on supporting Ukraine. And connected to that is also something that perhaps is slightly, looking towards the future, but some foundations have been set, is thinking about what kind of security architecture for Europe without Russia and autonomous of the United States. And I think the UK has a big role to play there alongside Norway and maybe other countries. So we have this landscape that's changing quite quickly. And I think the challenge will be to make sure that the bilateral talks actually keep abreast of these challenges, which will be led by events rather than by institutional or diplomatic niceties. So that's something I think that's moving fast. I'll leave it there. I've got plenty of other points, but I can make them later.
Thank you. Alex, Julian talked there about building for the future. I mean, this is where the innovation, the tech side comes in, which you could argue is an easier way for the EU and the UK to work together because it's forwards looking, right? It's not about what we used to do and how we used to operate. I mean, could you talk a bit about how innovation and new military technology actually helps this kind of development?
Yeah, I mean, you could say that Europe got two memos on innovation. One was from Mario Draghi on competitiveness, and the other one was from Vladimir Putin when he invaded Ukraine on the 24th of Feb 2022. And in the private sector, certainly, you see, innovators racing to respond to that second memo. So if you look at Ukraine, if you think that innovation, necessity is the mother of innovation, well, an existential fight is definitely the mother of innovation. And you can see a very lively ecosystem in Ukraine. You can see the EU stretching out to it, with the IET having a hub there and the UK's Tech Bridge having a place there, and a very kind of lively ecosystem of innovators. And I think there's something to really build on that. And, everyone talks about the way that the Ukrainians have innovated on UAVs, but another part of what they've done is to kick the Russian fleet out of the Black Sea without having a navy, so starting from a blank page. And those lessons that they've iterated and then implemented, in an innovation terms, so subsea drones and all the other bits of cleverness that they've used, are now being deployed to the Baltic Sea and the North Sea, where we're worried about Russian grey zone activity and cables being ruptured. So it gives you a very graphic feel for how that's working, and that's private sector innovators, really rushing ahead. And just even if you step back from there, to take some recent examples, of big EU Europe AI successes. So Helsing is an AI business for defence that was started by Thorsten Ryle, who is a German who built up a gaming business in the UK, studied at Oxford University, Sussex University, set up a business with 100 million donation from Daniel Ek of Spotify and some money from Marcus Wallenberg at Saab. And now that is going to be, in the same way that Airbus is, a sort of AI backbone for a lot of EU and UK defence AI stuff. So you can really see how that ecosystem works. It is much quicker and more supple, obviously, than some of the political processes.
Yeah, but this is all very positive, right? And to me, it seems all terribly obvious. But there are much bigger things here that are getting in the way. And actually, some of them are quite small, like sand eels, which apparently are really very small. But to be quite serious, how much of an irritant is it to the people who see this as really bloody simple and obvious that we're also negotiating other parts of it at the same time. So Julian, I mean, you talked about how now, you know, safety is also about migration and JHA, and this is something that Giorgia Meloni keeps talking about, you know, don't look at my headline GDP spending number, think about how much I do in the Med. That kind of stuff is good for the UK, but also means that the EU say, okay, well, let's talk about migration, and let's talk about people to people and other non-core defence areas. Does that help or hinder this?
So I think you said obvious and straightforward. It's obvious, I think, you need to address these issues.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily straightforward. There are internal complications, but there are also, if you make it all linked and you insist that you can't move on anything until you can move on everything, obviously that makes advancing an overall package more complicated as well.
Yeah.
And at one end of the spectrum of those challenges, there are some who suggest occasionally that you have to have done everything on fish before you can do anything on defence. You know, as was said in the last session, that is quite a challenge. Obviously, you're going to have a process around some of these things that rolls forward with different work strands. I hope we can avoid getting too stuck in a logic that holds everything back to the pace of the slowest work strand, because I just don't think that will be meeting the challenges. But that said, I do think it makes sense to be looking at foreign policy and security policy coordination, because you need to agree what your objectives are. It obviously makes sense to be thinking about the internal security stuff, because even if we'd like it, the threat from extremist political and religious-based views hasn't gone away, so we should be cooperating on that. There's a real job of work to be done, as has been stressed by a number of people, in cracking down on some of these horrible human trafficking gangs, etc. So I don't think you should say you shouldn't be doing those things, and you obviously should be trying to work on defence for the reasons that you've just set out. And at the dinner last night, they were talking about the need to develop various capabilities and the need to find ways of funding those, providing for them effectively. And I think they're right. The capability analysis is a challenge. You need to do it in a way that is, you know, transparent and cooperative between allies. The funding is a challenge, but on both of those, I think the EU is getting its act together and is becoming more effective as a provider of these objectives and means on the defence side. And the UK is obviously a valuable partner. You only have to look at the integration of the defence industrial base across Europe, not just in the cutting edge stuff that you've just been describing, but in missiles. The MBDA is a joint enterprise. In various air capacities, Airbus is a joint enterprise. Even, you know, tried and tested French companies like Thales have got supply chains that integrate the UK as well. So I think that it's kind of, in that sense, obvious that you need to find ways of doing this together.
I'm glad you brought this up, because I wanted to ask the two of you, there are some in the EU that think we could do this long term without America, or at least they hope that they could do this long term without America. So why on earth would they think that they need Britain? And how much does this bi-European lobbying effort from the French, with the support sometimes of the Cypriots and the Greeks, affect this discussion with the UK? Are you seeing it in the private sector? Do you see it, Rosa, when you talk to officials, that actually the Brits are thinking, wait, are we going to do a security deal with a union that might start thinking medium term, we only buy European?
Well, I think my impression is that British officials are sitting on the fence as to whether Europeans
Surely not.
will... Yeah, no, I mean, honestly, I don't think we have very clear signals on this.
Yeah.
But, I mean, you just need to look at the numbers. You just need to look at the figures. You just need to look at the state of defence spending in Europe. I mean, the logic, there is a very strong functional logic for greater cooperation. We live in an era in which international politics calls for greater cooperation among small and medium-sized states if they want to address these, but all countries are in a bind because domestic politics does not really allow that. So that's basically where we are. I think From my point of view, on the one hand, there can be big ambitions to negotiate everything before you can do anything. On the other hand, you can create other ways to support sort of habits of cooperation. Yeah. And in that, I would actually cast the view wider than just security and defense, where, as I said, the Ukraine imperative is really going to push things forward. But there are plenty of other things that can be done. Think of EU-UK cooperation in the Balkans, or in relations with Turkey, or now that the US is pulling out on foreign aid. There are so many gaps that need to be plugged on supporting human rights and democracy around the world, supporting funding for multilateral institutions, having conversations about what kind of alignments can be found among countries with respect to the big challenges that the US-China rivalry will pose. Yeah. There's a whole host of areas where Europeans can talk more and better and more regularly together to either flesh out common positions or at least coordinate what their positions are. Yeah. And if that creates habits of cooperation, and if politicians are able to sell that to their publics, you've got a case, which is we need to cooperate, because unless we are together, we're going to be thrashed by these forces and these international politics. So we haven't seen this. We haven't seen this on either side. We haven't seen this in the UK. We've seen a landslide victory in Parliament that is not reflected by a landslide change in the country. The Brexit hangover is still there, and the government is being cautious, which is understandable. Obviously, the Brexit question doesn't have the same type of toxicity in European countries, but you still have nationalist forces, you still have the radical right, which is making the case against cooperation at the European level, and these are all, they easily mobilize forces to protect very small interests of sectoral groups such as fisheries. So there are similar challenges. But I mean, the international context is one that calls for a different type of narrative, and it calls for counter-narratives to what is happening.
I completely agree with Rosa, but I think that, and actually with Julian, which is unsurprising, but I think that anaerobic discussion about, it was really interesting to hear Sandro and Stella talk about, Sandro saying, you really do need to implement the TCA, and Stella saying, well, you need to look forward as well, because the reality is if you're going to sell this to citizens, that slightly anaerobic discussion about the TCA, definitely we need the TCA implemented to build trust, but we've got to have something to aim for, and that for me is around innovation together and joint projects which are attractive to do together. It's about youth mobility as well. I think, Henry, you talked about the US, how does the US play in this? It feels to me like, when I see some of the most successful European businesses, and that's, I'm at sort of tech interface here, the most successful European businesses typically have in them talent from many European countries, and typically they manage to do that thing, which is to get the US to pay for their R&D, because what they do is they come with a good idea, they get a US venture capitalist fund to back that idea. They then scale in the US, and then the benefit comes back to Europe. And I think that game of kind of lobbing up the ball for each other and smashing it over the fence to the US, I know that's not very. I don't think that's the way people are thinking today. But I mean, that does feel to me like something we should all be doing.
But does this require sort of a big bang moment, or sort of like someone taking a leap of faith, whether it's the UK paying into a 100 billion fund that then pays for Polish and Greek air defence? I mean, something that seems quite outlandish, but actually would be a way of saying this is a way of building trust. Does it require someone to take that big step?
Can I just leap in on that that big bang thing? Because the fun thing I think is really important. Civil servants as a breed are really bad at kind of taking big bets on innovation in a fund. Because, civil servants, and with due deference to the civil servants or ex-civil servants in this room, are often about de-risking policy options rather than taking bets. and I just think that, yes, I think it would take a leap of faith. Paying into a big fund would be good. And then also having the bravery or the license to take procurement bets that are feed into multi-annual revenue for companies.
Just I'm not reacting to anything that's just been said in any way, but just to play it the other way around, I think it is probably right that if we're looking for a boost in cooperation between the UK and the EU, particularly on the defence industrial capabilities side, it might bizarrely turn out to be easier if you were talking about a big fund and big sums of money than if you're talking about small funding and small sums of money. It's just, I think, going to be institutionally harder to get over the hump if you're saying, well, there's there's 1.5 billion in play via the existing EDIP, but there might be some complexity to working your way through this. That is going to be harder than if we're not predicting it's happening. Even you aren't predicting it's happening in the FT yet.
We don't
but
predict. We don't predict. We report.
If there is movement gradually towards reprioritizing existing spend, boosting existing spend, finding new and novel ways of funding spend, and you end up with a much bigger pot, then I just think it's going to be politically, in an odd way, easier to say, well, look, this is now serious. We better get involved in finding a way of making this cooperation work.
Yeah, especially given the context of Ukraine, right? I mean, this can be a catalyst for that. I'm struck by how in the Brexit negotiations and everything that followed, it was always the EU saying, you must talk to all of us at 27, and don't you dare try and cherry pick and pick us off and yada, 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 all stuff. In this space, however, it's slightly different, isn't it? Because in defence, certain players actually might want to talk bilaterally to the UK more than they might want to talk as a 27. Rosa, is that complicating what's going on here? That the French, the Germans, the JEF countries, they have their own relations with the EU that aren't always completely across the gamut, whereas von der Leyen is saying to Starmer, let's talk about this big whole thing. I mean,
I think from my perspective, the way things are going, it's going to be a number of countries that are going to step up, are going to team up together, and what the Commission needs to do is provide the incentives for this to work and to institutionalize it insofar as it is possible. I mean, from my point, there are a lot of existential debates in the European Union, is it European EU security and defence, etc., etc. I mean, the key point really is results. What is the result that we need to achieve in order to protect Ukraine and Europe's security from the Russian aggression, and what is the best way towards it? NATO people have been saying, be careful not to duplicate. And I think that is a very strong message that European states should take seriously. The other bit of it is the public opinion. We've talked a little bit about this, right, in the context of Brexit. Now we have Rutte, who gave his first speech in December. He said, NATO countries need to spend more. At that point, it was still talking about 3.5. Now we're talking about 5% of GDP. And if that eats into other budgets for health, welfare, etc., so be it. It won't make that much of an impact. This is the narrative that is coming out. And I think we need to counter that narrative. We need to say, first of all, during the Cold War, we were spending a lot more on defence and we were building up our welfare states, first point. Secondly, if we don't take care of our security, we're going to have a problem on the welfare side as well. But thirdly, this is about economic innovation. It's not just about building tanks. And so if we can rethink the industry, defence industry, around an economic model that is compelling, that provides new training, that provides new economic opportunities, then you're recasting this in a different way. And then if you have a group of countries leading, others will follow. Because that's what happens. And civil servants might not be very good with big ideas, but they're very good at win-win packages, and that's something they can work around. But the Commission needs to put the incentives there. It needs not to step on the toes of member states, because this is an area where national sovereignty remains important, and they need to create packages that will be attractive and that will gradually bring on board many more countries. Countries like Spain and Italy are not going to be spending even 2% of GDP soon. Okay,
Yeah.
so we're going to have a group of pioneers anyway, and that's the reality. And I think that's we can think up nice ideas, but we need to bear in mind what the reality is.
So Julian, by that token, if you agree, why is Starmer meeting with 27 and von der Leyen and Callas and Costa when he actually should be meeting with 10, 12, 15 and saying, look, we're the ones that really matter here. Let's come up with something that works for the 16 of us, not 28.
Well, they are.
He has, yeah. No?
Exactly.
So on defence,
Yeah.
specifically, on other subjects as well, but on defence and security specifically, he has had a series of meetings and indeed reached new agreements with the Germans, with the Poles, a refreshed agreement with the French, all big security players, deeper dialogue with the Nordic and Baltic countries, important defence players. So I don't think that this is, this isn't either or. It's both and. But if the EU is, as I think it is, collectively getting more serious under the existential challenges about becoming a defence and security provider, including by using its ability to shape collective action, whether that's through aggregating demands or arrangements for procurement, or even sort of setting standards, again, as long as it can do it in a way that is transparent and open to other allies and partners. And if it is, as it is, generating more funding to try and boost this agenda, then I think it's right that the UK should be trying to engage with the EU collectively as well. That doesn't make me uncomfortable at all. I think it's quite sensible to try and do both.
And where does NATO come into all of this? I mean, we sort of see NATO as the sort of hard security bit, and the EU is now positioning itself as the defence industrial part, but NATO's been trying to encourage that for a long, long time and basically been ignored. How do we make sure that those, it just seems like this enormous matrices of relationships.
But Henry, NATO has that fund. It has the NATO Innovation Fund, right?
Yes.
Just appointed a new head who was formerly the head of innovation at MOD, John Rich.
Yeah.
So that's and too, isn't it? And haven't we got over that argument where it used to be like, oh, let's just do it through NATO, not the EU? Aren't we? We're going forward in tandem now. Isn't that what we're doing?
Well,
it's better than it was.
Why are we sharing all this money around in a NATO context? Because that's the Canadians, it's the Turks, it's loads of Balkan states that aren't EU. I mean, you can see where I had to come up with all these silly phrases. The most EU of the EU guys in NATO, I'm thinking of the Spanish, the Italians, the French, are going to be saying, well, maybe we should keep this pot of money just for the EU lot. You can see where all these different networks, Jeff complicates it too. I mean, how do we make sure that we're not just overlapping and overlapping?
Well, I mean, shall we just say this is the most EU NATO we've ever had. I mean, the Secretary General of NATO was Prime Minister of the Netherlands for a long time. The ambassadors to NATO, most of them have actually worked in the EU or in the European directorates at home. It's actually quite an extraordinary coincidence that they all know the EU mechanics so well. And of course, Rutte has put EU-NATO cooperation on his priority list. So if this is not a good opportunity to find the synergies and the complementarity between the two, I don't know when that opportunity might come.
And again, although we're not predicting that this will happen, should there be a movement towards thinking about new and novel ways of raising funding, including collective efforts to raise funding, last time I checked, NATO didn't have a central bank or an ability to issue bonds. So there is definitely a potential role for the EU, especially if you're being, ambitious.
What role does Trump play in all of this, do you think? Does it make it more or less likely that this moves faster?
It didn't move much the first time around, did it?
No.
But I actually think, when I travel around Europe, I meet people. I feel that our lawmakers and policymakers oscillate between denial and overestimation of the ability of Europe to respond to what Trump is promising. And so that, to me, that is the biggest problem we have, actually. We don't have a shared understanding of the nature of European power and how it can respond to geopolitical shifts, and we certainly don't have a shared strategy. And this is what we've been talking about. Those of us who've been studying this, for 20 years. This is the leitmotif of all our analysis: is Europeans are divided, right? How will Trump impact it? I think Greenland was a big shock. It certainly was a shock to me, right? Having spent a long time, trying to understand what Trump's potential impact on Europe could be. And I think this could unleash other movements, other things that could in turn change things. I think next year Iceland is going to have another discussion over whether to apply for EU membership.
Yeah.
Who knows? Maybe Norway will follow. Then, at which point, the UK might start to think, well, maybe we can find some other arrangement with the European Union, more ambitious. We also have, the enlargement process has a new momentum, so-called, and it's a big if, but let's just hypothesize that the EU institutions and its member states are actually serious about enlargement, and we get Montenegro in a couple of years, and maybe Albania, that Ukraine has a solid path. That again is going to change the landscape in Europe. And going back to what I was saying about, the need to rethink this security architecture in Europe, well, EU enlargement will be part of that. And these countries are not going to join immediately, as fully fledged members. The whole talk in the enlargement context is about staged accession, progressive integration, etc., etc. The UK might be interested in that. It's all good to talk about the institutional arrangements, the bilateral diplomacy, but let's also talk about how these changes might change people's perceptions of security on the continent, might change people-to-people relations. There are things that can change.
One imagines the Commission would be slightly less strict about their accession criteria if Norway applied.
On the Trump thing, I just like to make a basic point, which is that he's very unpredictable, and he's built unpredictability into his system. And I think, he's given his envoy 100 days to sort out some kind of Ukraine negotiations with Putin. So let's kind of see what happens at the end of that, because I think there's every chance that Putin will overplay his hand on Ukraine, because in fact he has no interest in a successful existing Ukraine, and then we don't know what Trump does at the end of that. So yeah, I wouldn't want to place a bet on this. He is unpredictable as a leader.
But worst case scenario, he turns on the EU. There's a big trade war, and it doesn't do the same to the UK. There is much less incentive for the UK to say, actually, we're going to stick with our mates here in Europe, thank you very much, and let's do more on defence and security when, the nukes are still being supplied by the Americans, and we're all chum-chums with Trump. There are ways in which, I take your point, Rosa, it could go very nicely, but it could go rather terribly. Julian, do you think there's a danger of that Trump actually divides the UK and the EU on this topic?
Well, I'm sure there are some people around him who might see that as an opportunity, and their notion of the US Western Hemisphere is more likely to include the UK than it is some of continental Europe. So there may be people who are thinking that direction. I think if we come back to ourselves and think about where the UK and the EU are, they should be trying to build these kinds of cooperation that we've been talking about all day, including in this session, because it works for them. Not because somebody else is telling them to do it or not do it, because they are countries that face shared threats and face them with shared values. And I'm not sure, we'll see how things progress, but I'm not sure that the Trump administration is going to undermine that sense of shared values between the UK and the EU. It may even conceivably reinforce a sense of shared values.
But also on security and defence, I mean, there are a plurality of countries in the European Union who are also NATO members, who are appeasing the United States on defence and are buying American. This has been the case.
Yeah.
This is what, and this started back in 2017, and has always been the case, in fact. So on security and defence, the UK is deeply tied to the United States. There's no doubt about it. On trade, the UK is deeply tied to the European Union.
Yes.
But I mean, the EU is also deeply tied to the US on both fronts. So yes, there could be hard choices, and that is certainly what Trump is pursuing.
Yeah.
But one would expect people in London and people in Brussels to have a hard look at what the long-term interests are. And again, the realities. And the realities are that there is a plurality of states that do not that are doubling down to keep the US engaged in Europe.
Yeah.
I think there's one thing, if I may say so, one thing Europeans all agree on, and that is a starting point, is that Europe should be part of whatever negotiation takes place about Ukraine and Ukraine. And that's one thing. Europeans, they all agree on this. The Ukrainians agree on this. Obviously, we don't know about the United States quite right now, and obviously Putin does not agree with this. But there is a common position among Europeans, and I think that should be, that should be a starting point.
I'm keen to get questions from the audience, but just while you think of them. My final question, a lot of this stuff is traditionally driven by policy, but also by personality. When you look at the slate of leaders and figures on this side of the channel and on the other side, and then people like Rutte, do you see the personal chemistry? Do you see the desire of these people to make this work? I mean, we saw how the von der Leyen-Biden relationship was really key to that transatlantic thing. I mean, do you see with Starmer and von der Leyen, with Callas, is this something that can work? Because this is about trust at the end of the day, right? Security and defense. If we're talking about big leaps as well.
Yeah, I'm quite encouraged.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, questions. Gentleman here at the back. If you could introduce yourself and, yes, keep your questions short and succinct. The gentleman here on the end. Thank you.
I'm known for UK is changing Europe. Is that what it works?
Can hear you.
Okay, that's fine. I've got two questions. The first is probably to Alex, which is really interesting what you were saying about innovation and the way the Ukrainians have sort of innovated using drones and like relatively cheap technology. But when you look across the defence ministries of Western Europe in particular, you see these big, clunky procurement systems. I mean, it seems to me that path dependence and institutional inertia means we're going to be very, very hard pressed to adopt that sort of agile stance when it comes to military procurement. I just wondered whether you thought there was any hope at all on that front. And the second bigger question about UK and EU is it seems to me that the nub of the problem is that the UK and the EU are staunch allies and bitter economic competitors. And the problem is that the latter bleeds into the former. It bleeds into the former politically. So when Macron says, buy European, that's partly a kind of there's us and there's them.
Yeah.
It also bleeds into it in a regulatory sense. So this government wants to make use of our AI freedoms, okay, and have a different, more liberal regulatory system than the EU. But if that's the case, it'll get in the way of all sorts of cooperation, including on the military, because our regulatory systems just won't mesh.
Great questions. Alex.
Yeah, Anand, on your first point, you could say that things that the UK and EU could do together is to, grow a pool of capital for more defence innovation or nurture the precious cargo which is our entrepreneurs across the continent. But actually, I think the single most important thing you could do is to disrupt the procurement process of these ministries that you're talking about. And you and I know that, the states, the United States had InQtel, launched InQtel in 1999. So we're at, InQtel is a CIA's venture capital arm. It gave you Google Earth. It gave you, lots of things that we now take for granted. And we've come very late to that in the UK and the EU. The UK has something called NSIF that has been, working with its German counterparts and stuff at the National Strategic Security Innovation Fund. But I think we're still not there yet. Oddly, Poland is doing really well in this space, where you need to have that thing of a venture fund where you place a bet and you say to has a good idea on defense capability, okay, we are going to give you, we're going to take a 3-year bet and you're going to get multi-annual revenue on that, and we may get it wrong. But every time a government department gives an order to an early stage company, gives a procurement order, a purchase order, they increase the enterprise value of that company by 20 times. So if you get a €1 million order from the French government, say Mistral, you then increase Mistral's value by 20 million, meaning that Mistral can then raise more funds, it can take on more people, it can grow in just the same way as the IRA is doing for US companies. So getting to that point, and that's really hard to do because you've got some really entrenched interests not only in the government agencies, government departments, but also in the defence primes, and that takes concerted political will to do. But it's really important.
Well, I think the bottom line is scale. I mean, if the EU manages to undo not even all the things, just a few of the things in the Draghi report, and create an economy of scale, then I think the way in which the UK will look at Europe, and whether it is a sort of economic engine that UK wants to latch onto or not, it depends very much on how successful that is. And you can think of that in terms of innovation, you can think of that in terms of, we didn't talk about research and development and international cooperation on that. I think that's really important because it triggers all sorts of other mechanisms for working together and incentives. But yeah, in the defence sector, that could also be relevant. So scale, capitals market union.
We've been trying to be positive and
we've been
ambitious.
trying very hard, let's be honest.
But I hope we haven't inadvertently given the impression that we think this is all straightforward and easy, because obviously it isn't. And the Buy European challenge, particularly for defence equipment and building the industrial base, it is going to be a difficult one. I mean, we shouldn't shy away from that. But I think it comes in different shades, and it's very important that that we're honest about that as we try and think our way through it. So one part of this is, are we building up this funding, collective EU funding, to buy American kit from Trump as some kind of mitigation strategy? Are we thinking that we're going to use it because actually we've identified precise requirements, and in fact some of those precise requirements are US built, missile defense, for example?
Yeah.
Are we willing to use it to buy some of that US kit? Are we more willing to use it to buy some of that US kit if it's actually made in Europe, like some of the Patriot package, for example? Do we distinguish between those challenges and the idea that some of this collective effort might include non-EU European allies, like-minded partners like the UK and Norway, for example? So I think we have to be clear about what the different questions are and not just bundle them all together. And one of the things that I find frustrating in the debate, we had a tiny bit of it in a previous session, is somebody says, strategic autonomy means we've got to buy European and we mustn't be giving all this money to American-built kit built in the US. Well, that collapses, for me, a number of different issues that it is better to separate out, if that makes sense.
But just to follow up on Anna's question, I mean, the defence industry has traditionally been one of, there is one winner on certain, it's procurement, you pick one thing and the other 4 companies don't get to sell you that plane or that tank, or, that's economic competition on steroids, right? And this is why.
Well, part of the problem in Europe is, of course, that you don't just have one plane or one tank.
There are
you
lots
have
of
loads of them.
but a country will buy one. not
Yeah,
not
but listen,
a suite.
listen, Czech Republic has been shopping around because there isn't available kit in Europe. So, you know, it's all very well to say, you know, we want to focus on our own national industry, etc., but if they're not providing what is needed, countries are going to go and shop in South Korea, and that's what's happening.
But my question was going to be, you know, if the French and the Germans and the Poles are right now fighting over 1.5 billion euros of EDIP, because the French don't want any of it to go to a German factory building American Patriot parts, what hope do we have for any kind of deal that might see some of that money, shock horror, end up in the UK? I mean, do you see my question?
Yeah.
It was sort of, it would require a massive change in thinking in that building over there and in the Elysee.
So, as I think I said in an earlier comment, bizarrely, I think it's harder when you're fighting
Small
over
amounts, yeah.
1.5 billion is not, you know, it's not peanuts, but I think it's harder when you're fighting over the allocation of 1.5 billion than it could be, and I hope will be, if you are much more ambitious. But even saying that, I do not deny that there will be challenges. Actually, you know what? The EU has proven in the past to be quite good at working its way through these.
Yeah.
Not always in an economically rational way, but in a way that delivers results. And as we've all been saying, given the imminence and the scale of the threats, I'm not pessimistic about people trying hard to resolve this.
Well, and we're seeing at the moment, and last night, the EU just breaks its own rules when it needs to make more.
So
money
you
available.
criticise, you rightly say that this is a challenge,
Yeah.
but if you look at it the other way, they are willing to break some of their rules, including rules that they've attached a great deal of importance to around the Stability and Growth Pact,
Indeed.
because they recognise that the challenge is, in some cases, you know, existential.
Well, I mean, otherwise we close shop. You know, it's not as if it's there's an alternative.
Yeah.
An alternative model is
Yeah,
obviously
then we'll
the
come to
Airbus model, where you have more than one European country being shareholders in
Sure,
a
but
company.
not 27 or 28.
No. Yeah.
And this is, there are going to be countries that are going to be asked to pay into a fund that aren't going to see a single cent back.
Yeah.
EU countries. Yes, the lady here.
Thank you. I'm Lucia Frigo, I'm a researcher. And I wanted to say, Rosa, thank you for mentioning the R&D and R&I. And I think cooperation in that field and in kind of knowledge sharing is quite important. We've talked about how important capital is, so we've covered that. But also, we haven't discussed how important it is for us to work together to bridge the gap that we currently have between us and China, or even us and the US. So my question is, do you think the Windsor Agreement, bringing the UK back potentially on Horizon and things like this, is it enough, or are we potentially leaving a low-hanging fruit to hang? And is there more that could be done in this sense? Thank you.
To rot, I think, if you don't.
Julian, you take this.
No, it was definitely headed for you.
I think ultimately it hangs on the question as to whether, and that I turned it to you because you said the TCA, maybe you said it last night, maybe you said it today, is a thing of the past. It's 8 years old, and and so we need to start looking forward. And I think for me the big question is really how pragmatically and flexibly do we move forward, based on gradually, the fact that Horizon is back on the table. I think how many Horizon projects have you been part of in the past, or at least I have, and then you've had a bit of a hiatus, and now the UK is back, and there's a different atmosphere. It's different. So move forward pragmatically based on experience, and then maybe rethink a broader agreement with a higher level of ambition. It's not going to happen. The politics in the UK are not going to make it happen on an ambitious scale at the moment. And for the EU, to be honest, I don't think it's a priority. So make do with what we have and see where there are windows of opportunities to improve things.
We have time for one more question. This gentleman here on the aisle. Just wait 1 second, sir. The microphone.
Yes. Asking a question that could lead on to the next conference. When the fighting stops, there will not be a Marshall Plan. I can assure you, having discussed this in Washington, there won't be U.S. money for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Europe, Brussels, and European countries will have a role to play. London may have a role to play too. This involves money and, of course, security. But I'd be interested on the economic construction of Ukraine, the thoughts of how Brussels and London, both City of London and British government might fit in.
Yeah, I think Trump's quite keen to invest in the critical raw materials industry of Ukraine. But it's a good question. I mean, I guess the way of reframing it is there's a limited amount of cash available, right? And how much of this is going to be about defense and security for stocks and future capabilities, and how much is going to be about Ukraine? How do we divide that up? Is it a way you make EU-UK relationship work?
I mean, I think it's a really interesting point in that, you know, the Marshall Plan obviously was reconstructing the manufacturing capabilities of Europe. What we've got in Ukraine is an agricultural exporter who's continued to export agriculturally, and with a strong tech sector. You know, they have something like 246,000 IT professionals. They're really strong on that, and so my bet is that their ability to generate money and for that to come flowing back into Europe will be strong. I'm sure that the Trump administration is absolutely counting on the EU, the Europeans, you know, EU, UK to fund the kind of rebuilding of Ukraine. I mean, I guess that will happen, but it won't be as ambitious as a Marshall Plan. I don't know. Would you?
Yeah, I mean, I think Ukraine, you know, go back to let's you know, in the hope that there is some kind of a ceasefire agreement and that a cessation of hostilities that is not, you know, does not lead to both sides rearming, but actually leads to, you know, looking at longer term prospects. Then you have reconstruction process and EU accession process. You'll have both working at the same time. I would say that it would be in the interest of major donors and investors to align to these processes, number one. I would say that it would be in the interest of, again, donors and investors to make sure that reconstruction takes place in a context of rule of law, which is a challenge in Ukraine. And that means working very closely with civil society. I mean, what the past 2 decades of Ukrainian history have shown us is that civil society really is, it's not the institutions, it's not the economic actors, it's civil society is the strength of that country. It's what has allowed Ukraine to push back on the Russians and what has allowed technological innovation for war. And so we need to make sure that that process is carried out together with them so that, you know, basic rules of transparency, democracy, etc., are respected. And in this context, somewhat paradoxically, Ukraine actually has a lot to offer to the European Union, more so than perhaps other countries that would like to join the EU, because they haven't had this sort of stagnation of an accession process that hasn't functioned for 10 years, and they have a very strong political impetus in the country to join the so-called West and to have Euro-Atlantic integration. So you have all that, you know, institutions, political leaders should see that as an opportunity. And yeah, I mean, it could potentially be something that drives things. We all know, again, we don't want to sound, you know, naively optimistic. I don't want to sound naively optimistic. I'm not. This is fiendishly complicated and difficult, but it doesn't mean it's impossible.
So, Julian?
I agree. I think those would be good problems to have, relatively speaking, because obviously the worst outcome is that the war just, the horrible attritional war just grinds on. But before we get to those problems, if there was to be a serious attempt at some kind of negotiated settlement that has a chance of enduring, then you're going to have some big challenges for Europe. One, how much of a voice does Europe have in that process? In as much as it does have a voice, how is it going to play into the challenges of some kind of territorial settlement, some kind of security guarantees, nature and form and deployments to be defined, and what does Europeans, what do they think about sanctions relief,
Yes.
which is going to be part of any process, whether you like it or not, because otherwise, what's in it for Putin?
Where the UK,
So
yeah.
there are some quite difficult gateway issues before you get to the challenges of reconstruction.
Very good. An excellent note to end on. That would be great cooperation between the UK and the EU. This is the end of the panel and thus the day. So all I need to do, I think, is to say thank you so much to Alex, Rosa, and Sir Julian, and a big round of applause for them.